I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the ongoing diplomatic fury over the impending visit of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who's scheduled to address a joint session of Congress on the Iranian nuclear threat in early March, when the Prime Minister will be in Washington for this year's AIPAC National Policy Conference. And I'm sure many of you have been following this soap opera that seems to be pitting President Obama against Prime Minister Netanyahu, though many of the things written and reported on mainstream television is proving to be an exaggeration or, sadly in some instances, fabrications masquerading as journalism. And as an aside, we've spoken time and time again about how we, as viewers and readers and consumers of the news, we must be very, very cautious in how we read and how we hear the news, because so often the reporting now is a function of ideology and not a response of the facts or of the truth. So here's the story. House Speaker John Boehner invited the Israeli Prime Minister to address a joint session of Congress on the Iranian nuclear threat without first informing the White House or obtaining administration approval for such an address. Now, no one disputes Speaker Boehner's constitutional right to invite anyone he wishes to address Congress. No one questions his right to do that. But people do question whether the Speaker was trying to humiliate the President and whether Mr. Netanyahu was needlessly exacerbating the strained relationship that seems to characterize the dynamic between him and Mr. Obama. Apparently, the White House feels that the Boehner invitation and Mr. Netanyahu's acceptance represent a serious breach of diplomatic etiquette. And the White House seems to feel Mr. Boehner's invitation is a deliberate partisan move by the Speaker meant to undermine administration efforts to reach a diplomatic solution with Iran on its nuclear program. The issue has been further complicated by the apparent fact that Mr. Boehner's invitation seems to have been suggested by Israel's ambassador to Washington, Ron Dermer, who's now being accused of pushing the Prime Minister's appearance before Congress as an Israeli partisan political move meant to enhance Mr. Netanyahu's stature shortly before Israeli elections later in March. And so now, key Democrats in Washington, including the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden, are saying they will absent themselves from the joint session of Congress as a show of allegiance to President Obama. So the controversy has snowballed into a major issue as Jews and Israelis are lining up on both sides, some arguing that it's an insult to the Israeli Prime Minister to suggest he should not address Congress, and that Democrats are now guilty of undermining traditional bipartisan support in Congress for the State of Israel, while others, including the Prime Minister's political rivals in Israel, are claiming Mr. Netanyahu is poking a finger in the President's eye and is harming the U.S.-Israeli relationship. By the way, one journalistic wrinkle to the story, which again relates to the way we should be careful of what we believe when we read the printed word, in the New York Times or elsewhere, or when we watch television news. For it seems that many were highly critical of Mr. Netanyahu for publicly announcing his acceptance of Speaker Boehner's invitation before the White House had been told of the invitation, thereby suggesting that Mr. Netanyahu had purposefully disrespected the office of the presidency and Mr. Obama himself. And this was a major story that ran in the New York Times and was reported by many in the media. However, the New York Times has now run a retraction of that story, saying that the facts were indeed very different and that Mr. Netanyahu only announced he would address Congress after the White House had been informed of the Speaker's invitation. So the facts now offer a very different story and cast Mr. Netanyahu's role in a very different light. And yet, the controversy moves on. And the latest twist and turn involves a suggestion that Mr. Netanyahu should cancel his congressional address and engage instead in private meetings with individual members of Congress. Well, for some insight on this sensitive and controversial issue, we're pleased to have once again on our JBS phones from Washington one of the most brilliant observers and analysts of U.S.-Israeli relations, the Vice President of the Woodrow Wilson International Center in Washington, and an individual who has served 6 Secretaries of State on Arab-Israeli negotiations, Aaron David Miller. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us again.
Pleasure to be here, Mark.
Aaron, you just wrote a fascinating piece for Politico in which you showed how the U.S.-Israeli relationship is much bigger than any disharmony between a specific president and a specific Israeli prime minister. And yet, Aaron, you know there are those in the Jewish community who are very polarized over the latest Obama-Netanyahu flap. As someone who's served in the halls of government for decades, did Prime Minister Netanyahu make a diplomatic blunder by accepting Speaker Boehner's invitation to address a joint session of Congress?
I mean, look, here's my view of this matter. It resulted from what I would describe to you as a perfect storm of 3 elements which came together and would be hard to assemble again. One is the end game with respect to the Iranian negotiation.
Yes.
And that is coming. Probably by the end of March, we'll know whether or not an agreement is possible. And I wouldn't rule one out. I'm not saying that it's inevitable, but there's certainly the possibility of one. And the U.S. and Israel, or shall we say President Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu, have different views on this agreement. America can probably live with Iran as a nuclear weapons threshold state. The Prime Minister is absolutely persuaded that Israel can't. So that's the first issue, and it's raising all kinds of concerns. Second is you have, for the first time in the Obama administration, a Republican majority in Congress that is determined, Speaker Boehner in particular, to assert its own views on some of the more contentious foreign policy issues of the day. Iran is clearly a matter of great and grave concern to both Republicans and Democrats alike. And finally, you have Israeli elections. This perfect storm, in my judgment, created a recipe which has brought out, let's just say, not the best judgment and behavior on the part of the parties concerned here. In a normal functioning relationship between an American president and an Israeli prime minister, even one in which there would be great tension, Begin and Carter, for example, Shamir and Bush 41, Benjamin Netanyahu and Bill Clinton. Those are 3 examples of relationships which have been very strained, and yet they were quite productive. In those relationships, I would find it almost inconceivable that you'd end up with this kind of scenario. And unlike those relationships, you now have a relationship between the president and the prime minister, which is not only dysfunctional, it's unproductive. And it's been ongoing now for almost 5 years, more than 5 years. And that's, I think, part of the problem here. And if, in fact, there is an agreement between the P5+1 and Iran, relations between the U.S. and Israel are only going to grow worse.
Yes. By the way, personally, from your perspective, and if I'm asking you a question that's inappropriate, you'll tell me. Do you lean one way or the other in terms of whether the world, America and the world, can live with Iran as a potential nuclear state?
Well, if we're talking about look, let me start this way, and I have a very negative and grim view on these matters. In my view, Iran wants to become a nuclear weapons threshold state, ultimately with the option of either breaking out or sneaking out to produce a weapon. You have 4 countries outside of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council that have deliverable nuclear weapons: India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. 3 of those countries are driven by a profound sense of insecurity and grandiosity. And Iran is the poster child. Mm-hmm. It is profoundly insecure, and it is profoundly entitled. And I would argue to you that for regime protection alone, a hedge against foreign intervention, that Iran wants to be in a position where it has the capacity and the option, should it choose, not just theoretically to produce a weapon, but perhaps actually to produce one. And this, to me, has been clear for some time now. Had Khomeini not overthrown the Shah in 1979, Iran would have been a nuclear weapon state already, and we would have enabled it. Iran would have been India. In America's conception of a responsible nuclear power.
Okay. All right, come back to the other issue. It sounds to me, Aaron, like you were saying that unfortunately you felt both the Speaker's invitation and Prime Minister Netanyahu's acceptance of the invitation was not the smartest diplomatic thing for either of those 2 men to do. Am I reading you correctly?
Yes, I think it's going to be far more costly for the Prime Minister. And by the way, when I say costly, I have no idea what sort of impact this issue is going to have on the outcome of the Israeli elections. But it's hard to imagine a similar set of circumstances emerging in any other pair of an Israeli president and an Israeli prime minister, however dysfunctional. And it flows from an inherent sense of mistrust, a lack of confidence. But again, as I mentioned, I think you needed all 3 of these factors to produce this. None by itself would have. I
understand. Very, very interesting analysis. Now, one of the things that concerns many in the Jewish community is the response that both Vice President Biden has had and other Democratic leaders of Congress who are saying they are not going to attend the session if the Prime Minister does, in fact, speak in March. And up till now, Aaron, this is something you've spoken about many times, there has always been major bipartisan support in Congress for the State of Israel. Does the Democratic reluctance, out of an allegiance to President Obama, does their reluctance to attend a session with the Prime Minister in any way, in your mind, undermine bipartisan congressional support for Israel?
No. I think that this is a sui generis situation. It's a response to a specific set of circumstances. My own view in the political article, I make the point that unlike Lehman Brothers, the U.S.-Israeli relationship is too big to fail.
Yes.
And I suspect, I believe that is the case for several reasons. But I also think that it's going to be very difficult with Obama and Netanyahu to talk about a reset. Usually, when the dysfunction is this severe, it can only be resolved by either one or both parties disappearing from the scene.
Yes.
Now, the president, according to our Constitution, will leave office.
Yes.
In about 20 months.
Yes.
So chances are that it really will require the passage of time, I think, and new players in order to restore and recreate. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that this is one-hand clapping. Bill Clinton dealt with Benjamin Netanyahu in 1999, and I would argue then Benjamin Netanyahu was a much tougher partner.
What was the issue, Aaron?
I'm sorry, what?
What was the issue? What was the issue? with Clinton.
Well, no, the issue then, we had an active set of negotiations that the Clinton administration wanted to maintain. And despite the Likud's aversion to Oslo, we ended up brokering not one agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians that Benjamin Netanyahu presided over, but two. So I think that look, it's a different mindset and it's a different time.
Okay. By the way, if you were buddies with the Israeli Prime Minister and you had lunch with him, would you say, sort of in an informal way, if there's any way for you to get out of this, you should?
Well, the question is, what does that mean? I think, and I did a CNN interview this morning with Chris Cuomo, and I said that Benjamin Netanyahu is in a box. If he comes, he is going to highlight the fact that there is a kind of a freeze in his relationship with Obama. I mean, there'll be no meeting at the White House. There'll be no Joe Biden in the background during the joint meeting of Congress. If he doesn't come, he's going to be hammered by his opposition and even by his supporters, who will argue, you made this into an issue of principle. It was critically important for you to address the U.S. Congress on Iran, and now you are not going because of internal pressures or external pressures from Washington. It's the worst of both worlds for him. Now, maybe the way to split the difference, although this is not an elegant fix, is to attend the AIPAC conference and not a joint meeting, or to stand up and give a speech and say the following: after I win, I intend to come to Congress and make my presentation.
Very interesting. I only have a few more moments with you. I want to change focus for 1 second. Aaron, many Americans now, including many American Jews, are concerned with the administration's overall foreign policy, something you've been involved with virtually your entire political life, as it relates now not only to nuclear Iran, but this war the West is in with Islamic extremism. And it seems to have been crystallized, Aaron, with the president's lecturing Americans at this recent prayer breakfast. When Americans either feel critical or morally superior to the savagery of ISIS, he reminds us that in Christian history, Christians did hideous things in the name of Christ, the Crusades, the Inquisition, Christian support of slavery. What was your reaction to these remarks by President Obama?
Well, what the president says is true. The question is, why introduce the symmetry?
Yes.
What's the point? You have radical jihadi terrorism and the beheading of Americans now. Why do Americans have to be reminded that in the past that Christianity had a darker side to it? I mean, it's an effort by the president to find balance, to find symmetry, and frankly, I just think it's frankly not relevant, and I would argue it's even inappropriate. We have a major problem on our hands, and how you describe that problem is critically important to what you intend to do about it. And I think it's in some respects the president's policies, which is essentially to prevent, to constrain, and to preempt, in my judgment, are by and large on track. I mean, I don't believe that the problem of jihadi radicalism in Syria is going to be resolved by putting 100,000 American ground forces into that country. And we've had that experience. In fact, you could make the argument that Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is the forerunner, Abu Musab Zarqawi, the forerunner to ISIS, was in fact a direct result and response to the American effort and ground war in Iraq in 2004. So that's not the solution. The solution, Mark, is governance, good governance. And the problem is the Arab world is melting down at a rate that is so frightening that you are likely to end up with more ungoverned spaces and more bad government.
Yes.
Libya, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, even Egypt, which is stable and homogenous, can't deal with the political and economic challenges that it faces. No, this is the long war, and my kids are going to be dealing with this problem because it's very much generational.
Aaron, does it matter whether the president uses the phrase Islamic extremism or Islamic terrorism or not?
I wouldn't. I would use a different. I'm not sure I would talk about Islamic extremism. I'd talk about radical Islam or jihadi terror.
Yes, yes. But you would not shy away from...
Absolutely not. I mean, 7 out of the 10 most lethal terrorist organizations in the world are Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
14 out of the 20 top countries that discriminate against religious freedom are Muslim. The vast majority of countries in this world that have laws against apostasy, which can be criminally prosecuted, are Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that the world's 1.6 billion Muslims are participants.
Of course
in the
not.
Jihadi struggle. That's not the point. But let's not go to the other extreme
Yes.
and pursue a kind of willful denial.
Oh, okay. So as we wrap up, look, you served 6 prior administrations. You understand how administrations think. Most Americans, by the way, you understand, Aaron, we have no clue what goes on behind the closed door. But you do. What do you think is driving either President Obama individually or his administration as a whole to sort of do everything it can not to talk about Islamic jihad or Islamic terrorism or to use the word Islam? What's behind it in your mind?
I think it's the president's own global sensibilities, his need to find balance, not to hint or imply any hint of general stereotyping or general discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he's taken matters a bit too far. We're about to convene February 18th in Washington, the White House, a summit called Countering Violence and Extremism. Well, I'm prepared to accept the fact that there is violence and extremism everywhere on this planet. But the violence and extremism that we're dealing with, that was responsible for 9/11, for Charlie Hebdo, that's primarily coming out of one region of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I see nothing wrong, let alone discriminatory, in acknowledging it.
Yes. By the way, I asked you a moment ago, if you had the ear of Prime Minister Netanyahu, what would you whisper in his ear? If you were a confidant with President Obama, what would your advice be to him on this specific issue?
I don't think I think the president is in a position now, frankly, where in the run-up to the Israeli elections,
No, I'm sorry. What would you say to President Obama about using and referring specifically to Islamic jihad?
You know, I would make his point and continue to make his point that we're not discriminating, stereotyping, generalizing about an entire religion.
Yes.
But I would then go on to make the follow-on point, that you're dealing with a brand of radical Islam that is a genuine lethal threat, and we have to acknowledge it. And I would also acknowledge the fact that the summit to counter violence and extremism, it's fine to have it in Washington, but the summit to counter violence and extremism should take place in Cairo,
Yes.
in Riyadh,
Yes.
in Damascus, throughout the region, because that's where the problem lies.
Yes. By the way, Aaron, it looks pretty impressive right now the way Jordan is responding after its pilot was burned alive and videotaped. What is your sense of the way in which Jordan has responded lately to ISIS and the war on terrorism?
I mean, I think the Jordanians, because they literally, in some respects, because of their geographic proximity to Syria, 2,500 Jordanians have gone off to, at least that many have gone off to fight with ISIS in Syria and the other Islamist groups. Jordan has a significant problem. I think the public has been slow to realize it. I think they do understand it now. But Jordan is a small country, vulnerable, and its military capacities are severely limited.
Yes.
The the new baseline for savagery and brutality that ISIS has created, burning this poor man alive, is not a game changer. It's not going to fundamentally transform the struggle against ISIS. This is a long movie, and it's going to be measured in years, not months.
Okay. Aaron, I said in the intro, I find you brilliant, and it is always wonderful to have your insight and analysis. I thank you for giving me some time. I wish you kol tuv v'hatzlacha, and you know I'm going to chase you, and we'll talk again soon.
Always a pleasure, Mark, and your words are too kind, but I appreciate it.
Thank you, Aaron. Be well.
Bye.
The thoughts of Aaron David Miller, Vice President of the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, and again, an individual who served 6 secretaries of state on Arab-Israeli relations, and amazing analyst on Middle East affairs. As always, I'm interested in any thoughts or ideas you have in response to the ideas expressed by Aaron David Miller. Please be in touch with me. Email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. My thanks for this edition of In the News to Sloan Copeland, to Serge Goldberg, Dara Golub, and Carol Lilienthal, our producer on this edition of In the News. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.